This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we get to talk with Dr. LaToya Brackett, Associate Professor of African American Studies at the University of Puget Sound, where she also serves as a member of the leadership team for the Race and Pedagogy Institute. She is a scholar with 2 degrees in Black Studies, one from Cornell University and the other from Michigan State. She is an interdisciplinarian who centers the Black experience. Thank you so much for coming and talking with us today. Dr. Brackett, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I will say that yesterday I was like, dang, I got to do this thing today. And we had a faculty gathering, and it's a reminder of the struggles of being a Black Studies scholar and being in Black Studies program and what's next. And then so I was just like, okay, well, you know what? I've been listening to these podcasts, and they've been giving me a lot of space in my head to think about our discipline. So I am still very much excited to be here. So thank you for the invite.
Well, we definitely appreciate your time, especially with it being the beginning of the semester. I know how busy it is. So thank you so much for making time today. So we can get started. How did you get into Black Studies as a field? You have multiple degrees in it, so I'm sure that there is a lot that you can say about not just how you got into it, but your continued commitment to the field of Black Studies.
Yeah, it's definitely a commitment. If you're going to go into Black Studies, you better be committed. So it's not for the light at heart, right? The lighthearted. And so I'll go back to, I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and it's interesting because now people know Charlottesville, Virginia with a more Black Studies lens, because we're looking at the critical aspects of the Unite the Right rally and the concerns that happened there and the loss of life, right? And so witnessing that, growing up in Virginia, I was like, oh yeah, that was probably going to happen. Didn't think it was going to be like that, but it's not something unheard of. But I didn't go to UVA, University of Virginia, which is in my hometown. I applied to Cornell University. And I got in, and I went for a student of color weekend, prospective student of color weekend. They call us pre-frosh. And I was like, yeah, this is where I'm coming. I'm coming here. I really enjoyed it. Actually, one of the people that I ended up rooming with for that weekend, Tawny Thomas, is actually, I think she's doing religious studies at Yale now, but she'd also went to UVA. It's always interesting how we all end up interconnecting over time. But I really enjoyed it. And then I got to go for a pre-freshman summer program. And so it's a sort of bridge program to make sure we're ready. And honestly, we call it COSEP 02. So whoever's listening, they like, yep. And it was students of color specifically. And there was 150 of us, and you get to take a class. And I was assigned, because I was in arts and sciences college, and I was assigned to an Africana class with Dr. Don Ohadike. And it was African civilizations. And I will say that was a really important moment for me. I had never thought about Africana studies at all. I think I had already signed up for, like, in the fall, I would be doing like sociology and everything. But I'm so glad that I had this opportunity in the summer. And there's a movie. I don't know if you've seen this film. I should have gotten the date of when it was released. It's called "Oh, the Gods Must Be Crazy." And it's unique. It's not something you just got to show anybody. It's got to be done in a class. But basically, it goes to some remote Southern African, village, right? And somebody that's flying, it's probably in the 1970s, 80s. Someone's flying a tiny plane up above a white man. He's drinking a Coca-Cola from a glass bottle, original Coca-Cola bottle. He throws it out. It throws trash. It's trash, right? And then, and it lands in this village, this not touched village. And they end up taking this bottle, and everybody fights over it. Everyone's fighting over it. By the end of the village, everybody wanting it and stuff, they send their best warrior to the edge of the earth. That's how he said it. The edge of the earth, into the earth, to drop the bottle off and be like, because you just destroyed this whole community. And if you really think, there's so much that you can unpack with that. That was just a beautiful thing. And I was like, this is a lot. But being able to have that happen in a classroom and not have it be laughed at, not have it, but be able to interrogate it and engage with, and reading Dr. Wadike's book himself, originally from Nigeria. He's originally from Nigeria. And then writing a paper and the Africana Studies Center. So I always remember that film. I haven't watched it since then, but I always remember it. And I remember what that means, and what it means to bring different civilizations, different aspects of civilizations into a culture and what it can do. And so Dr. Hadike, once we walked from the Africana Studies Center, which is up on North Campus. It's one of the farthest, locations. And we were walking back to main campus arts quad, and we were going over the suspension bridge. Ithaca is gorgeous. Like, yes, we're beautiful. It was a beautiful campus. And I was like, this is worth it. In the wintertime, not so much. It's still beautiful, but it wasn't so fun. But Dr. Hadike and I were walking, and he was the first person to ever give me a compliment on my academics without it being like a grade and written. Mm-hmm. And he said, you write really well. I was like, oh, thank you. And he says, I'm giving you an award, because this summer thing gets an award. And I was like, oh, cool. He's like, I probably shouldn't have told you that. I said, you probably shouldn't have, but I'm good with it. So each class that had some of us students in it, like the pre-frosh in it, would have like an award or whatever. And honestly, that was one of the most important moments of my life, and the validation, affirmation. And I like affirmations as a professor myself. And I I encourage students in different activities in class to give those. And that felt great. And I came back for the fall, and that bridge program was dope. And that's what my PhD was actually on, researching bridge programs for students of color, but Black students particularly at predominantly white institutions. So it did come full circle. And I've also started one here at the University of Puget Sound. But it was just like, okay, so in the fall, I was like, well, I'm going to go take these other classes. I took that sociology class with all them people in the class, and the professor, I'm sure he was a nice dude and all, but I was like, what is happening? So I ended up switching back. Well, I did that semester, and then I started taking Africana classes, which were smaller. Mm-hmm. And I will be real, like, they were intense. And Dr. James Turner ended up being the mentor that I connected with the most. Unfortunately, Dr. Hadike had a stroke, I think, in my second year. He came back, and I remember seeing him and talking to him, but he didn't make it. So by the time I graduated, he had passed. But I will never forget Dr. Dono Hadike. And so Cornell has a really rich history in Black studies. And I ended up taking even a summer session with Dr. Turner, and learned about the history of Black studies at Cornell. And it reminded me that, hey, this is something people have fought for. Mm-hmm. One of the constants throughout these podcasts, because I've actually listened to a good portion of it, I'd probably say like 2/3 of the ones that are out, is, this recognizing the struggles, right? The fight to get the discipline in the first place, and being one of those really first interdisciplinary kind of approaches in higher ed. And, if it's not a fight that Black people have, I don't know what else there is. And so it was really a space for me and my identity, but also to be able to learn in a way where everything mattered, everything connected. And I think that was something I really appreciated with your conversation. I think is it Kona? Kane. My apologies. With talking about the methodologies. That was I was like, oh, this was really great. And it really had me like turning in my head a lot. And so Dr. Turner was a sociologist by trade, by his original discipline, but the Africana Studies Research Center also was kind of independent of the university too. So it had a lot of space to do what they needed and what they wanted. And I took some amazing classes. And I will tell you, the most terrifying professor I ever had, Dr. James Turner, but also the one that ended up being like, this man is cool. But he did the Socratic method. So he would call out on you. And you had to read. And we all read. But sometimes we just didn't know the very specific thing he was asking for. Mm-hmm. But I figured out how to navigate that. Because if you got the major at the time that I was there, you had to take 2 James Turner classes. And we all were like, oh my God, can I make it? And I did. And I'm grateful for it. And it was Cornell was the best decision I ever made. And I'm glad that I was able to go there, because then after that, I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do next? Apply for Teach for America. Didn't get it. Isn't that interesting? Um, and then I applied for PhD programs directly. And I went to Michigan State, got in there for their AAAS, which you know about,
Mhm.
your alma mater, and African American African Studies program. And when I got there, I started, and I got to connect with Dr. Richard Thomas, and he's in history, and he was my mentor there. But the second year that I was there, I also started a counseling program at Michigan State. So I got a master's in counseling there. And I think that that's been one of the strongest aspects of my training in regards to being a teacher, a
Mhm.
pedagogue, and especially at a small liberal arts school that I'm at. And so honestly, the counseling probably also is one of the reasons I haven't given up yet, because it's a lot. But yeah, I did my PhD there. And then I'll be honest, like, getting a job was hard. I couldn't get one for a long time. This is the first tenure track that I have. And I actually had to fight for this tenure track position by doing a visiting for 3 years first, proving myself. So I've before that, I had a couple of adjuncting gigs, but when I couldn't get a job with my PhD, I went to Taiwan and taught English to little kids for a year. And then I came back. So it's been a long trajectory. But also, when I did my interview for University of Puget Sound, it was on November 3rd, 2016.
Well,
So I got back to Taiwan, and all the students were like, teacher, what happened? And I said, I voted, okay? I voted. Uh, Even absentee, I voted. Washington State, they sent it all the way to Taiwan for me, and I voted. But it's it's a reminder that Black Studies doesn't go away. And once your eyes are open, I actually apologize to some of my Black students in particular, because I said you can't shut it off after you've come into this classroom. It doesn't go away, because now you're like, oh, I kind of understand why things are the way they are and why they impact me this way, and you can't really turn it off after that. Um, but the other students, white students in particular, I'm like, you get the choice, and that's that privilege. So I haven't been able to turn it off, and I'm so grateful, but I'm also tired. It's a struggle, right? So that was a long trajectory, but hopefully got here, and kind of see that dedication that I do have, because a lot of people are leaving a lot of Black folks are leaving higher ed. Let me put it that way,
yeah.
or the classroom even. So it's not easy, especially in times where you think you were getting better, and then all of a sudden we keep going backwards, and we're getting the biggest hit, right? So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, so that's kind of my trajectory of how I got to where I am now. I'm so grateful to be in an actual department that is Black Studies, and not being a token in somewhere else, but having a micro space out of the macro space of higher ed, and being able to know that when I go, I'm good in that space. The rest of it, is the same everywhere.
True. So I actually did not know that you picked up a whole degree in counseling while you were doing your PhD.
I sure did.
I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about that. Like, I know that in AAAS, like, we have our specialization that we had to do in addition to our Black Studies courses. And, you mentioned your mentor was in history. So you have this really interesting combination. And if you could speak a little bit to how you situate yourself with these different fields that might not necessarily, like, counseling is very hands-on and practical in a way that most people wouldn't think that, like, history is. So how do you how does that come together?
I think that's, I'm really glad that I had multiple, because even my dissertation committee, because Dr. Turner, oh, rest in peace. Dr. Thomas was my chair. And I remember him being like, because I was working on, because I'm coming together with all the aspects of Black Studies, but with the counseling component, that kind of like hands-on retention kind of about retention of students, Black students. I had help from my professors over in counseling, but the head the person that was the chair of the department at the time, she had left, the Black woman. She was the one, she actually recruited me. She actually came over to AAAS, was like, you should consider this. And I was like, I will consider that. And it was really a great experience. And I met some really great colleagues as well. And they're doing their counseling thing. I will say that, like, I wish counseling was more accessible for those folks like myself who don't have money to be able to do an internship, to get my hours and all those things after that. And then the accreditations are different from state to state, and I wasn't trying to stay in Michigan. So there's a lot of things with that. And I thought that would be a quote unquote practical degree, but my Black Studies lens can tell you exactly why it's not for Black people, right? And that's something else to think about. And so I'm going to keep doing that. I know it. And Dr. Thomas is going to be like, child, why are you doing that? And then he used to call me, he would call me by a different name. So here we go. We're switching it up and he was literally like a surrogate grandfather to me, and I miss him dearly. And that's probably another reason why I need to call him. But Dr. Thomas would say, I can't really tell you how to do this part. So get those people over there in counseling to help you out. I was like, but I need all of y'all. And that was a difficult component of our program. And I love that y'all had that conversation, I think in like your second or third episode, about our program in particular at that time. And kind of everybody was in another, like the professors we had were in other disciplines. And so they were dedicated to those disciplines. And Dr. Thomas, this was like, I was his last graduate student ever. He retired and that was it. And so he was, he got his he know what he doing. He got his stuff. But I was able to learn from him some of those very important skills, because history is at the base of Black studies. You got to know the history. You don't know where you're going, right? And right. So I'll never forget one of his things is like, go to the back of the book and look up the sources. I was like, okay. So, and I always want to cite. And I was like, okay, well, there's some things that people just know. And then I do pop culture of all things. I'm a pop culture focused Black studies scholar. And so I'm always like, okay, well, what's the history from this? And then I'm like, well, I can't be doing okay, that's going to take forever. I got to jump to this, but what do I need to give the people as the base? But then also with counseling, it's like, well, I don't want to use big words just to use them. How do I reach people? And at the base of Black studies is prescribing. Like, you have those 3 tenets, and it's like one of them is prescription. So what are we doing with our work? There's no point to create something that's not going to be tangible in some way to make an impact. What that impact is, hopefully everybody has that in mind. I don't want to just write to write. I don't want to just publish to publish. And so the hands-on component of it and everything, I think also allows for me to see something that others don't. I'm going to shout out a mentee of mine, Jade. She's like, Dr. Brackett, people can't think like you. And I was like, what do you mean? And it's taken me a long time, because she'll say, you'll say something, but we can't see it yet. And looking back, I was like, I guess I learned that in my counseling degree, because you have to really, so even having to train to talk to people through a counseling session, you don't give advice as a counselor. That is just a no-no. You're actually trying to get someone else to work towards understanding what's happening to them and what they need, and they make those decisions, right? And I give them the tools or help them with the tools, right? That's the goal. But one of the things we also have to do is if someone shares something with us and they're saying, let's say someone's just like, you know what, I just really can't do this and it's just too hard. We've got to find something to say, well, I remember when you talked about this other thing and, you did that. And then we have to reframe what they're saying so they can look at it in a different way. And honestly, that's exactly what Black Studies is constantly doing. So when we're correcting, right, because that's another one of the tenets, we have to correct that history. So we describe, we correct, we prescribe it. And so I'm always trying to correct something. I will say my colleagues across the disciplines don't always like that. And I'm not going to hold back on it, but I do know that it definitely is harmful to me in regards to my career and my psyche, honestly. And I think that that's something we really need to be talking more about, is that, everybody wants to say, oh, we have Black studies, it's our shiny thing at our university, but it doesn't mean we're going to sustain it the way it needs to be sustained, which is not just money, but like time, effort, and the support of recognizing the layered aspects of the fact that the students come to us. It don't matter if they're Black or not. I bet you if you were to, this last year in academia, and I'm sure this fall is going to be interesting too, in relations to Gaza and Israel and everything. And I bet you if you were to talk to professors in Black studies, like specifically Black studies programs, not Black professors in other departments, like possibly, but Black studies programs. Ask them if the students are coming to I remember there was one conversation I think that you all had, and someone was saying that Black studies departments need to be doing more at the forefront of that, of the Gaza and of the Israel aspect. But I'm like, we also have to be at the forefront of the harm that's happening with us, because that didn't go away either. And so, but it doesn't mean that students aren't coming to us to ask for those insights. And we're also having to deal with, well, what does it mean to be Black right now in America? Are we going to talk about, is it Sonia Massey? Are we going to talk about that? Are we going to talk about, are we going to, or is it the fact that the protests are over? And that's something that you and John talked about in your first episode. And there was something he said there that I was like, oh my gosh. And you also said, oh, I never thought of it that way. And that was about Black studies, this idea that once there's a death, we get money.
Yeah.
And so he said, growth comes from death. And I wanted to say, growth comes from Black death. And then I went further and I said, growth comes from Black death and white immunity. And so, and white immunity there is an actual concept that Cabrera, colleague, friend of mine, that he's written about a book called like White Boys on Campus, and then he talks about white immunity. So, and I was like, okay, I see what you're doing there, instead of just white, like, because we have the white privilege. He's like, well, what about white immunity? And thinking about, but that was actually really, I was like, you know what, that is so true. That is so true. And we are not waiting for moments like that. That's the other thing I would say, is that Black studies is always on the grind. We're always on the chopping block, and we're always in crisis because nobody wants us. And so when people are like, I'll never forget, and I'm sure this happened at your institution when, COVID hit, and then they're like, we don't have any students. And then everybody's like, oh, we got to cut programs. My colleagues in these other departments, I've never seen people so anxious. I was wondering what was happening. And then I was like, oh my gosh, this is new for them. Oh, this is new for you. Oh, okay. Oh, you never been on the chopping block. You never had to really worry about that. We do that. That's the foundation of our discipline. So it doesn't mean that we don't think we're going to be cut. It's just that we're just used to the fact that that's just what it is. So, but I think I went on a long tangent but hopefully connect. That's Black studies for me too. It's never a tangent. It's just, you uncover everything. Like, that's what our discipline is. It's like, it's not detached from anything. You can't detach something from what you're studying. Yeah. You can't say, oh, I'm just going to focus on this. I'll never forget, I was at a National Women's Studies conference, the one that was in Puerto Rico. And it was Bell Hooks was there and Angela Davis. And I was like, yes. But I went to a panel. I don't remember what they were talking about. And I asked her a question. Don't ask me what the question was. But I remember her response saying, I'm a political scientist. I don't talk about that. It was a Black woman. And I'm kind of like, oh. And I think to myself, there's no way that I would be able to say, I don't talk about that. But rather, I haven't thought about that angle yet. Would love to talk to you more about it. Or I haven't thought about that angle, and my head's turning right now because I'm really thinking about it in a different way. And I appreciate you giving me that look. And so when people are saying, this conversation about disciplines, it's like people are making it seem like, because of your podcast, I've been digging deep about the fact that Black studies is a discipline. And I think we need to, when we move forward, we need to start talking more about it, in the sense that what we do, the pedagogy that we have, the method that we have, is no stone unturned.
Yeah.
There, and you can use any and everything. And that sounds like the innovation I think you had mentioned. And I talk about pop culture, Black pop culture being innovative. Like, that's what Black people are. Since enslavement, that's how we survived, is innovation. Black studies was innovation. And then now everybody want to take it. So I'll leave it right there.
Take it and make money off of it too.
Yes. And then I can't. Yeah. But I can't make the money because I'm a Black woman who has degrees in it. And I can't, everybody's meant, most of the podcast, a lot of the podcasts to talk about how, but, having a Black studies PhD, one of the reasons I couldn't get a job was because I had a Black studies PhD and no one wanted to hire me unless you were in a PhD program. I overheard someone being, actually it was I was working at Eastern Washington University, and I overheard the people in the Africana Studies program. I wasn't teaching. I ended up getting a coordinator position there. And I overheard them trying to look through some of the applications for a lecturer. I hadn't applied to that, so that was no big deal. So I wasn't listening like, but it ended up being someone from our program that hadn't graduated yet from the AAAS program. And they said, well, he's never taught any classes in Black Studies. And as you know, at the time, and I think we might have an undergraduate program now, but I don't know at Michigan State, but we didn't have an undergraduate program in Black Studies. So there was nowhere for us to really teach. So when people are listening to all these podcasts, we taught in writing, rhetoric, and American cultures. We taught writing. So this colleague of mine who hasn't graduated yet, who's applying to this position, these folks, none of them who have Black Studies degrees, by the way. None of them in this Africana Studies who are full professors in Africana Studies. They're all Black. That is the definition in Eastern Washington University at that time. They're saying he's not qualified because he's never taught a Black Studies class. And when I did apply for a tenure track position at EWU, and I was also on leave, I took a medical leave because of a lot of stuff that had been happening. And so I couldn't go to campus. I got an email saying that I didn't qualify because I hadn't taught any classes in Black Studies specifically, and that I hadn't taught online. And I was like, y'all teach people how to teach online. And I have a degree. I have 2 degrees in Black Studies, and I've taught. Tell me how this makes sense other than the fact of what? Finding a reason to get to push someone out, or finding the reason to say, maybe we don't want a Black Studies scholar because we're realizing how critical Black Studies scholars will be of the program that we have and the way in which we do it. It's not, and one of the things I want to ask people now, and I think that that'd be a great podcast, is like, are you doing Black Studies or are you doing something Black?
Yeah, that distinction is real.
Mm-hmm. Or are you Black? So it's like multiple things, right? It's like, and the third one, right? And that's part of the next, I know, part of the questions as well. So I'll pause right there as I went on I feel bad for my students because I kind of go like this, but they were like, but we like it when you do that. I was like, are you sure you're not just trying to take up time? They were like, no, we actually do like it. I was like, all right, I just got to get them to do this now. That's my goal. Get them to go on tangents to find all the connections, and that's Black Studies, but also counseling based on what Jade has probably told me.
Nah, that was, as you said, like Black Studies touches everything, right? And there is an episode that's coming up that hasn't dropped yet, where Dr. Nathaniel Norman describes Black Studies as all encompassing, right? He was like, it is the most comprehensive degree you can get.
Love it.
And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what it is, because it is about, and I did another one yesterday where Dr. Makalani said that, it's about the questions. That's the method. And you echoed that, right? Like it is about, here is the question that I have. Now, as a Black Studies scholar, I'm going to use every tool available to me to figure out the answer to this question.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And having to know that breadth of information, having to know multiple disciplines, having to know multiple methodologies, having to put together a path to answering a question in a way that is not as straightforward or is not pre-described for you is what Black Studies does. And I think, as you said, like that is not only discounted many, many times, it is also something that does make a distinction between like, are you doing Black Studies or are you looking at Black stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. And talking about Black people and it's, and it's, I'm trying to find that moment in Black Studies where we really create this, I'm using Siri McDougall's book. I think it's just Africana Studies or Africana Methodologies or something like that. And it's interesting though, because he is on NCBI. He's on the board for National Council of Black Studies. Mm-hmm. And I had published something in their kind of like yearly report. And so he was like, let us know something. I was like, oh, just letting you know, after I'd already submitted and got approved. I was like, I use your book in my research methods class. And he said, let me know if anything needs to be added into it. And I was like, yes, that's what Black Studies scholars are doing. And I love that text because it gives my students direct examples in each section of okay, this is what we talk about when we talk about ethics and why Black Studies looks at it differently, right? And all the angles you should be considering it. And so I think that that's also something that students just can't comprehend too. They're like, it's just too much. It is a lot. And they're used to being they'll be in a different discipline. They'll come to my class and say, well, we never talked about that in that discipline. That I'll hear from another professor that actually respects what we do, saying, so-and-so from your class was talking about this. And then we went on a tangent about that. I was like, great, because they're going to be an educator, because it was an education department. And our education department is great. So, but I'm sure there's other professors that are like, where you get that from? Or they shut them down, period. And, and that's also part of my counseling ability, to be able to just lean in and find tools of just like, okay, how do I sometimes just get other students to answer the question. If it's something where you're like, oh, if I answer this, they're going to feel hurt. How do we have this conversation so that I'm not going to be attacked and dismissed by the student, so they'll keep learning and that we can do it collectively? But it takes a lot of effort. And also with Black Studies in my one-on-one, I'm always setting up foundations for them to know, this is what Black Studies is, this is where it came from, this is why you should be grateful that you even have a class in it, right? And then I ask my students in my one-on-one how many have actually had Black teachers before. And over the time that I've been here, it's like less than 50%. A lot of times it's getting to be more than 50%. Not professors, I mean K-12. And then I'll ask them about professors, like, you can't count me because we just started. And so I also ask them to share their nervousness, and we do it on a poll everywhere so that people everybody can see it. Like, you're not alone. Welcome to a really hard space. And yeah, I mean, I think that there's other conversations, because we're talking about, are you just doing Black stuff, or are you just believing that because you have that identity, that therefore you know it? And that's something that I thought it was interesting that John brought that up in your first podcast, not you, but a white man, right, brought up how Black students would think that they already knew stuff. And I think that that's one of those conversations that us Black Studies scholars, and in particularly Black faculty in Black Studies, need to have more conversations about, because it can be very traumatic on both sides, right? Because you're doing it usually in front of white people, right? White students. And it's a really delicate thing. But there's a conversation to be had about also white professors or non-Black professors teaching in Black Studies. And it's not about, because I know eventually they're going to figure it out. They've got their thing. But have you thought about what it means for me to ask those same questions you might? So I appreciate it. Like, I really am digging deeper into what you all have been working on, because it's been making me think. And I'm also like, if y'all do a second season of this, you should consider like a pedagogy season, like having those deep conversations about it. Because John mentioned an assignment, and I was like, he said to tell them to read a book. I forgot which one, How to Be Black or something like that. And out in public. And I was like, have you thought about how, if you have Black students, asking them to read How to Be Black out in public versus a white student, and possibly at his default, which would be a white lens, of reading it. So, and he didn't mention it in there. I'm sure he has to think about it at some point, but like, what does it mean? And how does that analysis come back differently? And how do you bring that into the space to make sure all the students are recognizing that these experiences are different, but also that the Black students also have to look at it in a completely different way of, I don't know, they might be like, oh, I didn't really pay attention, because they're already used to being looked at a certain way, right? So it's like, how do you break all those layers down? And so, yeah, but also just this idea that Black folks think because they're Black that they can do what we do. And the fact that we are so dedicated to say, I'm going to do this PhD program in Black studies and know that I'm going to have a hard time proving a whole bunch of things, it's really difficult to then know that you possibly won't get a job somewhere because they can only afford to, the university, to put a Black studies, quote unquote, aspect program, whatever, if you can do a history program or sociology program, and they won't hire you if you don't have that graduate level, at least master's thing. And that's something I wish I would have known more about going into our PhD program. But yeah, so, Steve.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And it's gonna be a lot this fall.
Oh, yeah. But we ready, because I mean, that's just our life.
Yeah.
It's so like, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I always joked about, like, after Trump became president the first time, I was like, this is just another Tuesday for Black people. So it's like, this was like another Tuesday. Like, oh, it was Tuesday. Oh, okay. It's not to dismiss that impact, but it's just like yet another day we got to get through. And that's Black studies and how it's built. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about the pedagogy aspect. And I definitely would love to have more in-depth conversations about pedagogy in general, because I am extremely interested in that, both because of my role and because we taught writing, right? So teaching writing, the pedagogy is talked about so much. And then my first 2 jobs after graduation were in writing programs. And again, we're always talking about the pedagogy. We're always meeting and discussing and exchanging things in a way that I don't think happens in a lot of other disciplines when it comes to teaching, especially if you are at research universities. But so I'm going to switch this next question just a little bit. What do you think about, or what interests you or excites you, or do you want to critique about the past of Black studies in terms of the pedagogy though?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I just gotta, recognize that we already talked about we wouldn't have Black studies if it wasn't for protest. And there's been conversations about that. And then being at Cornell, one of the most famous images, from a Black protest in the time is at Cornell. And I actually got to meet some of the people who were marching alongside them at a 50-year anniversary. And that was a really important moment to have that original oral history primary source kind of aspect, right? And ask the questions about what did it feel like and being able to actually engage. But the pedagogy, there's something I think, I was reading a Manny Marable. So I get my students in my 101 to read a couple pieces about the importance of Black studies. And there's a piece in the New York Times from 1995 or 96 by Manny Marable talking about the 3 aspects and stuff. And I think that and about Black studies. And I really appreciate that piece because it's also pretty accessible. It's not too long. And, if you wanted to, you can just take some sections and it's 101 and we don't have a lot of time. They may never take AFAM again. But I appreciate that. And then I started, because of just the generation of students that we have, they're interested. And I think that's another reason why it's so important that we all really lean into Black studies, because this is what the students are flocking to in one way. They may not be saying, I'm going to get a whole degree in it. But if you pull them enough, they realize, I can do a lot with this information, right? But there was an article, I think it's by someone who's an anthropologist by trade and a geographer. And I believe that she speaks on the importance of when she started using Black studies, Du Bois even. So I think other people have talked about, I started reading something by someone who would have definitely been a Black studies scholar. And then she was like, oh, this is so important. How did I not know this? I can't do what I do without the scholarship of Black studies scholars, right? And so that's what I have enjoyed seeing more so today. I think in the past, one of the things that I would say that I've picked up on in my later days of being Black studies scholar is, there really wasn't a focus on Black women back then. Even in my Africana studies, courses, I was like, did we really talk about Black women? Did we really? Not really. And even, I was lucky to have a couple of women professors, Black women professors and everything. But it's not until I'm with my colleagues who do focus more on the Black women's struggle. I have a colleague who's created a course called Black Fictions and Feminisms. And I'm like, okay, let me learn from them, right? So it's that's been missing, I think, or the fact that even myself being like, shoot, I need to change my pedagogy because of what the past has put upon me. And how do I do it? And being able to constantly think about what the students need. But I think one of the things that the past has perpetuated into the current that I need us to stop for the future is that if you have a PhD and you're Black, then you're qualified to teach Black studies. So that is where it's like, so how are you defining Black studies? And this is even with the African American Studies AP aspects. People are saying it's African American studies, and I'm like, it's talking about all aspects of African American life, but it's not necessarily doing all aspects of what African American studies is expecting of you, which probably won't be able to be done in K-12 at the level that we would want it to, which is like protest, whatever. And so people are combining all these things, and they're like, oh, you just get to study Black people. It's like, no, you're not just reading Black stuff, watching Black stuff, and then say, oh, that was Black. Like, no, there's a lot to it. And so because of how young our program still is, it makes sense that the people, the scholars, came from so many disciplines. And that is a part of what our discipline is. But it's like, those scholars were protesting. They were literally epitome of what they were putting into the discipline. And then slowly we get this, and then you get this aspect of like, hey, let more Black people into universities. Okay, we get affirmative action that didn't go well because they're like, oh, just hire this person because they're Black. And you can create a Black studies program, but is it a Black studies program? Or is it that the university, so we are working at white supremacist institutions that are trying to appear the way they need to appear, but they don't have to function any differently. And they're going to hire someone that's going to fit what they need and do it as they would like. And so those of us who are literally like, no, we need to change that. That don't make sense. Or, I mean, because for me, being a Black studies scholar, also, it doesn't mean that it stops at the classroom. It just doesn't. So when students are literally having trouble with financial aid, that's a part of Black studies to me. If you're Black student or not, you poor, that's part of Black studies too, right? So all those things are happening. And that's not always the case when you hire someone because they have a degree in something and then they allow them to be in this space. And I'm going to say this because I really picked up on this when I was at Eastern Washington University. And then I had so much trauma going on there, and it was coming from our own people. And well, one of them wasn't our own, but it's the Black folks that allowed this person to be who they were because they would co-sign. And so what I was on my medical leave, and it was like the last week, and I see someone says, girl, look at the news. I said, what's on the news? And it was Rachel Dolezal, who was found out to be a white woman this whole time. And I could have, I wrote a whole Medium post about that. You can read it. But I couldn't write it until like years later after Jessica Cruz. I was just so internally like, what is happening? Because the support for Rachel Dolezal by Black folks and the complete opposition even to myself. And she doesn't have a degree in Black studies of any sort. Now, that woman is smart, though. She knows the content. So I got to give her that. She's probably a little bit better than other people, except for the engagement with the students is not on the Black studies way. And then the way in which she goes about it is really problematic of like, I'm Black, so hire me. She knew that if she was Black, she'd be hired. And that was something that I noticed in that department. And it really bothered me because I couldn't get a job to teach in the Africana Studies department that I worked in as a staff member, but she could. And at one point, something was taken from me and given to her. And so it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, so wait a minute. And I also just said how we have somebody that was applying to this position to be a lecturer. And they said, oh no, they never taught Black studies, an actual Black studies class listed as such, but they had Black studies degree, but you're dismissing them. The institution allows that. The institution is saying we will allow Black people to decide. We don't care from what walk of life you are. If you're Black, you get to decide what Black studies professor we're going to hire. And if Black people co-sign on it, then we're good. And unfortunately, when I was looking for jobs, it was like, it's getting better now. They'll be like, oh, any field is study. Never Africana studies, African American studies, PhD, any field, make your preference for English because we want literature. They always want literature, right? It's like, dang, I should have did that. But that's a part that I'm really concerned about. And the hiring of folks. And then the other component of, if it's not a department, in my department, we know what it means to do Black studies. Mm-hmm. And we may not all have Black studies degrees, but the way we do it and our micro space matters. And if you're only going to hire one, and then that other component is if you do hire someone that is a Black studies scholar that was trained in it, or at least has taken the time, effort, and work to be that way, if they go and be the only person in a whole department of, non-Black studies folks, they may never get tenure because people don't understand what Black studies is. And so for me, I'm like, so when do we shift to recognize that there's enough of us out there to be hired and to build? And when do we ask our other Black colleagues in higher ed, can you make sure that we get a chance first? Because we don't have any other opportunities. So it's also this DEI aspect, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and then the moment you do get a job of any sort that has a DEI aspect on it, Black studies on it, you can get jobs and get jobs and get jobs. But there's no comparative of what it is that you actually bring to the table and if it fits what it is that is Black studies. So I wanted to share that. Like, that's something that's really deep, right, for me. And also, even for our undergrad, it's like, because you took one class with me does not mean you know Black stuff. And I always tell them, y'all are down here. I'll do like a little bucket kind of analogy. And some of y'all are up here and some of y'all think y'all all the way up here, but you're really down here. And I'm all the way up here. But guess what? I just want to get y'all on the same level about right here. And then I might still be above you, but guess what? I have so much more to learn too. It's not over. And so I'm trying to, and that's also what Black studies is. It's never done. Yeah. Things change. So I think that I think it's the hiring. And it's the fact that we are a part of an institution that is built on white supremacy that is like, you should just kind of be happy we even let you be here. And so any power that we have, being able to take that back and being able to press and say, hey, we really need someone that is qualified. Your race does not qualify you for something. And that's where we get into trouble, right? But also it'll show up in the classroom. And then it makes our discipline look like it's not on top of things when we're not the ones in charge of our own hiring for our discipline in that way, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much. You have given me so much more to think about and to engage with. And, if I can talk to John and get him to do season 2 that's focused on pedagogy, I'm definitely going to ask you to be back because I do think that is really important. And I've learned so much just from this brief conversation that we've been able to have today. So thank you so, so much for your time. Is there anything you would like to add before we end?
I think that what you get to do is pretty dope if you got to have a conversation with Nathaniel Norman, because I'm sure you read the Norman Reader just like I did. You did? Oh, right.
No. That was the part
you did.
I
was like, I still use it.
Look, I still have my reader.
Yes, I got my notes and everything. There's one that's like, but where do we belong? Where do we really belong? And that's about the Black women and Black studies or gender studies and stuff. But I think this is a great space in which we get to hear all the different intellectual engagements with Black studies and also personal engagements with it. So I appreciate that. And everybody just needs to realize, like, if they're telling us, if they're banning our books, that means we're doing something right. And also just realize that this new generation, there's some of them out there that have never seen an image of the segregated water fountains. And I found that out this year in one of my classes. And so I'm not giving up. And that's part of my dedication. So please, keep doing what we're doing. And let's see if we can make more spaces like this and spaces where we can actually have those conversations and see what's next. So appreciate y'all for starting that conversation.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.